I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw the bright orange notice plastered across my barn door like some kind of scarlet letter. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough that my knuckles went white and my heart started racing before I even put my truck in park. The barn that my grandfather built with his own hands in 1967, the barn that had stood through hurricanes, ice storms, and Florida's brutal summer heat, apparently had a massive "condemned" sign on it, courtesy of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. I'm Harrison Sawyer, and I'd been living in this house in Ocala, Florida for the past 8 years. The property had been in my family for generations, long before this cookie-cutter subdivision grew up around it like weeds. When the developers came through in the early 2000s, my parents refused to sell, so now our 3-acre lot sat like an island of authenticity in a sea of beige vinyl siding and manufactured charm. The HOA had been formed 5 years ago, and they'd been trying to bring us into compliance ever since, despite the fact that we predated their existence by decades. I jumped out of my truck and strode toward the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The notice was dated 3 days ago. 3 days. I'd been in Atlanta for a work conference, something I couldn't avoid, and apparently that was all the time the HOA needed to make their move. The paper flapped in the late afternoon breeze, and I ripped it down to read the fine print. Structure deemed unsafe and condemned pursuant to HOA Covenant Section 8.4.2. All contents have been removed and sold to recover assessment fees and violation penalties totaling $17,342. Property owner has 30 days to demolish structure or face additional fines of $500 per day. My vision actually blurred for a second. $17,000, sold the contents. I yanked open the barn door, which creaked on its ancient hinges, and stepped into the cavernous space that had been packed with equipment just 4 days ago. It was empty. Completely, utterly empty. My grandfather's 1952 Ford tractor, worth at least $20,000 to a collector, gone. The antique woodworking tools that had been appraised at $15,000 last year for insurance purposes, gone. My own workshop equipment, including a nearly new table saw, drill press, and lathe that had cost me $8,000 just 2 years ago, gone. Boxes of my father's things that I'd been slowly going through since he passed, irreplaceable family photos and documents, gone. My fishing gear, my camping equipment, tools I used for work, all of it, just gone. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed the HOA office. It rang 4 times before a chipper voice answered. Riverside Meadows HOA. This is Patricia speaking. How may I provide you with excellent service today? This is Harrison Sawyer at 2847 Old Mill Road. What the hell did you people do to my barn? There was a pause, then some typing. Oh, Mr. Sawyer, yes. We've been trying to reach you about your violations. You have numerous unpaid fines, and the structure was declared unsafe by our Property Standards Committee. We had everything removed and sold according to our covenant enforcement procedures. You had no right to touch my property. That barn is structurally sound, and you never conducted any kind of actual inspection. According to our records, Board President Deborah Finch personally inspected the structure and determined it was a safety hazard and an eyesore that negatively impacts property values in the community. Deborah Finch. Of course. The woman had made it her personal mission to bring my property into compliance since the day she was elected HOA president 2 years ago. She lived in one of the McMansions 4 streets over and had never worked a day in her life, spending her time instead making everyone else's life miserable with her petty tyranny. Deborah Finch is not a licensed building inspector. You can't just condemn someone's property because you don't like how it looks. Patricia's voice took on that patronizing tone that HOA employees must learn in training. Mr. Sawyer, when you purchased your property, you agreed to abide by our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The CC and Rs clearly state that the board has authority to maintain community standards. I never agreed to anything. My family owned this land before your HOA even existed. We're not part of your association. More typing. Our records show that in 2019, the county rezoned this area, and all properties were automatically enrolled in the HOA as a condition of the rezoning. You should have received notification. This was news to me. I never received any notification, and even if I had, you can't force someone into an HOA without their consent. That's not how property law works. I'm just telling you what our records show. Mr. Sawyer, if you have concerns, you can file an appeal with the board. They meet the third Tuesday of every month. However, you'll need to pay your outstanding fines before your appeal can be heard. You're telling me I have to pay $17,000 in bogus fines before you'll even listen to my complaint about you stealing and selling my property? We didn't steal anything, sir. We followed proper procedure for covenant enforcement. If you continue to use hostile language, I'll have to end this call. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Losing my temper with the office secretary wasn't going to solve anything. Fine. I want copies of all documentation related to this, the inspection report, the notices you claim you sent, the authorization for the sale, receipts showing where my property went, all of it. That will require a formal records request. There's a $50 processing fee, and it takes 10 to 15 business days. Of course there is. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. I spent the next hour documenting everything, taking photos and videos of the empty barn, the condemned notice, everything. Then, I got in my truck and drove straight to the HOA office, a converted house at the entrance to the main subdivision. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but there were still lights on inside. I parked and walked in without knocking. Patricia looked up from her desk, her eyes widening when she saw my expression. Mr. Sawyer, the office is about to close. I want to speak to Deborah Finch, now. Mrs. Finch isn't here. As I said, you can file an appeal and then give me her phone number. I can't give out board members' personal information. A door opened behind Patricia, and Deborah herself walked out, a designer handbag over her shoulder. She was exactly what you'd picture, perfectly highlighted blonde hair, too much makeup, workout clothes that cost more than my truck payment, and that expression of perpetual disapproval that seemed to be a requirement for HOA board presidents. Harrison, she said, managing to make my name sound like an insult. I heard you were back in town. I assume you saw our notice. You had no right to touch my property, Deborah. None. And we both know that barn is perfectly safe. It's been standing for almost 60 years. She adjusted her handbag and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The structure is an eyesore and brings down property values for the entire neighborhood. We've had numerous complaints. The inspection clearly showed dangerous structural issues, including a compromised foundation, rotting support beams, and a roof that could collapse at any moment. That's a lie, and you know it. That barn is solid as a rock. My grandfather built it to last. I have the inspection report right here if you'd like to see it. She nodded to Patricia, who pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me. I flipped it open. The inspection report was 3 pages of vague descriptions and generic safety concerns, signed by someone named Robert Chen, licensed contractor. There were no photos, no specific measurements, no detailed findings, nothing that would hold up to actual scrutiny. This is garbage, I said, holding up the papers. This isn't a real inspection. When was this Robert Chen at my property? Last month. You weren't home, so he conducted an exterior inspection. You can't condemn a building based on an exterior inspection. That's not how this works. And you certainly can't sell someone's property without a court order. Deborah's smile grew colder. The CC&Rs give the board broad authority to enforce community standards and collect unpaid fines. Everything we did was legal and proper. If you have an issue with it, you're welcome to hire a lawyer, though I should warn you that the HOA has a very experienced legal team, and you'll be responsible for all legal fees if you lose, which you will. Where's my stuff, Deborah? Where did you sell it? The contents were sold at a public auction to recover your unpaid fines. The proceeds went into the HOA's general fund. You had over $17,000 in violations, and the auction only brought in about $12,000, so you actually still owe us money. The casual way she said it, like she was discussing the weather, made my blood boil. My grandfather's tractor alone was worth $20,000. The woodworking tools were worth $15,000. You sold $40,000 worth of my property for $12,000, she shrugged. We got what we could. Public auctions don't always bring full value. That's not our problem. You had no right. None of this was legal. I was never properly notified of any violations. I never consented to join your HOA, and you never conducted a legitimate inspection. This is theft, plain and simple. As I said, hire a lawyer if you think you have a case. Deborah walked past me toward the door. And Harrison, you have 30 days to tear down that barn, or the fines start adding up. $500 a day adds up quickly. Have a nice evening. She walked out, leaving me standing there with Patricia looking uncomfortable behind her desk. Is there anything else I can help you with, Mr. Sawyer? She asked quietly. Yeah. Start looking for a new job, because when this is over, there's not going to be an HOA to work for. I walked out and sat in my truck for a long moment, trying to think clearly. Everything Deborah had said was wrong. You can't just force someone into an HOA without proper notice and consent. You can't condemn a building without a licensed inspector conducting a thorough examination. And you absolutely cannot seize and sell someone's property without a court order, even if they do owe you money. That's what liens and proper legal procedures are for. I needed a lawyer, a good one. I pulled out my phone and started searching for property rights attorneys in the Ocala area. Most offices were closed for the day, but I left messages at 3 different firms explaining my situation and asking for emergency consultations. Then I drove home, walking back through the empty barn with my phone's flashlight, cutting through the gathering darkness. Every empty space where something had been felt like a punch to the gut. My dad's old workbench, where he'd taught me how to use tools. The corner where we'd stored Christmas decorations going back to when I was a kid. The rack where I'd kept my fishing rods, some of them gifts from my grandfather. All of it, just gone, sold off like trash to line the HOA's pockets. I hardly slept that night. By 6 the next morning, I was up and researching. I pulled every document I had related to the property, the deed, tax records, title insurance, everything. Nowhere in any of it was there any mention of an HOA. The deed made no reference to CC and RS or covenants of any kind. My property was deeded free and clear, no restrictions. I also started digging into public records online. The county rezoning Deborah had mentioned did happen in 2019, but the record showed that several properties, including mine, had been specifically exempted because they predated the subdivision. There was even a note in the Planning Commission minutes where my mother had appeared at a hearing to ensure our property rights were protected. So Deborah had lied. We weren't part of the HOA, had never been part of the HOA, and the HOA had no authority over my property whatsoever. At 8 o'clock sharp, I called the Marion County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to someone about filing a theft report. They transferred me around a few times before I got a deputy named Martinez on the line. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Deputy Martinez said, after I'd explained the situation. The HOA came onto your property, removed items worth approximately $40,000, sold them at auction, and kept the money? That's exactly what happened. They claim I owed them fines, but I was never part of their HOA to begin with. I have documentation proving my property is exempt. And they have some kind of fake inspection report claiming the building was unsafe? A 3-page document with no photos, no measurements, nothing specific. Just vague claims about structural issues that don't exist. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Mr. Sawyer, this sounds like it's going to be complicated, involving property law and HOA regulations. That's usually civil territory. But the taking of property worth that much without legal authority, that could potentially be criminal. Why don't you come down to the station and file a formal report? Bring all your documentation. I was at the sheriff's office by 9, a thick folder of documents under my arm. Deputy Martinez was a solid-looking guy in his 40s with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. He listened to my story, examined my documents, and took detailed notes. I'm going to be honest with you, he said when I finished. This is murky. HOAs operate in a weird legal space, and they often overstep their authority because homeowners don't know their rights. But what they did here looks like it crosses the line from civil dispute into potential criminal activity, especially if you were never actually part of the HOA to begin with. So what happens now? I'm going to forward this to our Property Crimes Division and the County Attorney's Office. They'll determine if there's enough for criminal charges. In the meantime, you should definitely get a lawyer for the civil side. You're going to want to file for an injunction to stop any further action against your property, and you'll want to sue for the return of your property or compensation for its full value. Can you at least find out who bought my stuff at this auction? Some of it is irreplaceable. Family photos, documents, things that have no monetary value but mean everything to me. Martinez nodded. I can request those records. The HOA will have to provide documentation of the sale if we're investigating possible theft. I left the sheriff's office feeling slightly better. At least someone was taking me seriously. My phone rang as I was walking to my truck. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. Mr. Sawyer, this is Nicole Ramsey. I'm an attorney with Ramsey & Associates. I got your message about your HOA situation. Finally, some good news. Yes, thank you for calling back. I need help, and I need it fast. Why don't you come by my office and we can discuss this in detail? I have an opening at 11 if that works for you. Nicole Ramsey's office was in a professional building in downtown Ocala, and she turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s with an air of quiet competence. I spent an hour going through everything with her, showing her all my documentation. This is outrageous, she said when I finished, and frankly, it's one of the clearest cases of HOA overreach I've seen. The fact that your property predates the subdivision and was specifically exempted from the rezoning makes their actions completely unauthorized. They had no legal standing to assess fines, no authority to conduct any kind of inspection, and absolutely no right to seize and sell your property. Can we get my stuff back? That depends on who bought it and whether they still have it. We'll need to subpoena the auction records. But yes, you have a strong case for recovery of the property or, at minimum, full fair market compensation. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But I'm going to be straight with you, Harrison. This is going to be expensive. HOA litigation can drag on for months or even years. I charge $350 an hour, and a case like this could easily run $50,000 to $100,000 in legal fees before it's done. My stomach dropped. I don't have that kind of money. I figured as much. That's what these HOAs count on. They have deep pockets and expensive lawyers, and they bankrupt homeowners who try to fight back. She paused, thinking. But this case is different. The facts are so clearly in your favor, and what they did is so egregiously illegal that I'm willing to take this on contingency. I'll cover all the upfront costs, and I take a third of whatever we recover. But I'm warning you now, I'm not going to settle cheap. We're going for full compensation for your property, plus punitive damages, plus your legal fees. We're going to make an example out of this HOA. I felt a surge of hope for the first time since seeing that condemned sign. When can we start? Right now, I'm going to draft an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking any further action against your property. We'll file it this afternoon and hopefully get a hearing within a few days. I'm also going to send a formal demand letter to the HOA requiring them to provide complete documentation of their supposed authority over your property, all notices they claim they sent you, the inspection report and inspector's credentials, and detailed accounting of the auction and where every item went. What if they refuse? Nicole smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. Then they're in contempt and we use that against them in court. Either way, they lose. They've made so many mistakes here that I'm honestly shocked. It's like they didn't consult their own attorney before doing any of this. Deborah mentioned they have an experienced legal team. They probably do, but I guarantee their lawyer didn't sign off on this. No competent attorney would approve seizing and selling property from someone who isn't even an HOA member. My guess is Deborah went rogue and did this without proper authorization, which means she might be personally liable for damages, not just the HOA. Over the next few days, things moved fast. Nicole filed the emergency restraining order, and we got a hearing scheduled for Friday morning. The HOA was required to send a representative, and I wasn't surprised when Deborah showed up with a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Gregory Walsh, the HOA's attorney. The judge was a woman named Barbara Chen, probably in her 60s, with the kind of stern expression that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. Nicole presented our case, walking through all the documentation showing that my property was exempt from the HOA, that I'd never received proper notice, and that the HOA had no authority to take the actions they did. Walsh tried to argue that the CC and RS gave the board broad authority and that all properties in the geographical area were subject to HOA rules, but Judge Chen cut him off. Counsel, I've reviewed the deed and the county records. This property clearly predates your HOA, and was specifically exempted from inclusion during the 2019 rezoning. On what legal basis are you claiming authority over it? Walsh shuffled his papers, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, the board believed in good faith that all properties within the boundaries were subject to the covenants. Good faith? Judge Chen's eyebrows rose. Did anyone bother to check the property records before condemning this man's building and selling $40,000 of his possessions? The board followed their internal procedures for covenant enforcement. Their internal procedures are irrelevant if they have no legal authority over the property to begin with. This is like your neighbor deciding they don't like your fence and selling your lawnmower to pay for removing it. They can have all the internal procedures they want, but that doesn't make it legal. She turned to Nicole. Ms. Ramsey, your motion for a temporary restraining order is granted. The HOA is enjoined from taking any further action against Mr. Sawyer's property pending resolution of this matter. They are also ordered to provide complete documentation of the auction within 7 days, including buyer information for all items sold. Walsh stood up quickly. Your Honor, the HOA has privacy obligations to the auction buyers. Then the buyers can file a motion if they object to disclosure. But in a case involving potentially stolen property, Mr. Sawyer has a right to know who has his possessions. 7 days, counsel. Don't make me hold your clients in contempt. Walking out of that courtroom felt like the first real victory. Deborah was red-faced and furious, refusing to make eye contact. Walsh pulled her aside in the hallway, and I could hear him speaking in low, urgent tones. I caught fragments. Never approved this, and potential personal liability. That went well, I said to Nicole as we headed to her car. That was the easy part. Now comes discovery, and that's where we'll really build the case. But Judge Chen clearly sees through their nonsense, which is huge. Having the right judge can make or break these cases. What happens with the auction documentation? We'll find out who bought your property, and then we'll contact them. Most people, if they realize they bought stolen goods, will return them voluntarily once they understand the situation. For the ones who won't, we'll file individual claims for recovery. That afternoon, I got a call from Deputy Martinez. Good news and bad news, he said. The county attorney is going to pursue criminal charges against the HOA board for theft and fraud. But it's going to be a slow process. These cases take time to build. What kind of charges are we talking about? Likely grand theft, given the value involved. Possibly fraud and falsifying documents, depending on what we find out about that inspection report. The inspector whose name is on the report, Robert Chen, claims he never inspected your property and never signed that document. His signature was forged. That was huge. So they faked the inspection report? Looks that way. We're trying to figure out who actually created the document, but forgery in connection with fraud, that's a felony. Someone's going to jail over this if we can prove who did it. My money's on Deborah. We're looking at her closely. But we have to build the case properly. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. Don't communicate with the HOA except through your attorney, and let us know if they try anything else. The weekend passed in a blur of stress and anxiety. I kept walking through the empty barn, trying to remember everything that had been in there, making lists for the insurance company and for Nicole. Monday morning, I was drinking coffee and going through old photos on my computer, trying to find pictures that showed the barn's contents, when someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find a man in his 60s standing there, uncomfortable looking, holding a cardboard box. "Are you Harrison Sawyer?" he asked. "Yeah, that's me." "I'm Bill Henderson. I bought some items at an HOA auction last week, tools mostly, and some boxes of papers. I saw the news story this morning about the theft investigation, and I realized the stuff I bought might be yours." News story? I grabbed my phone and did a quick search. Sure enough, a local news station had picked up the story. HOA faces criminal investigation after illegally selling homeowners' property. The article had all the details, including quotes from Deputy Martinez and even a brief interview with Nicole. "Yeah, that's my stuff," I said, looking at the box. "Can I see what you got?" Bill brought in the box and I started going through it. Hand tools mostly, nothing super valuable but all useful. And then, at the bottom, a smaller box that made my throat tight. Photo albums, my parents' wedding album, pictures of me as a kid, my grandparents' anniversary photos, irreplaceable memories that I'd thought were gone forever. "How much do you want for this stuff?" I asked, my voice rough. Bill shook his head. Nothing. I don't want any part of this mess. I feel terrible that I bought stolen property. I just want to do the right thing. I really appreciate this, Bill. More than you know. There's more, he said. I was talking to some of the other people who bought stuff at that auction. A lot of them saw the news and are having second thoughts. I've got phone numbers for some of them if you want to reach out. He handed me a piece of paper with a list of names and numbers. This was better than I'd hoped. Over the next week, I contacted everyone on the list. Most of them were willing to return what they'd bought once they understood the situation. A few wanted to be reimbursed for what they'd paid, which was fair. One guy, who'd bought my grandfather's tractor, was a harder case. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had a small farm about 20 miles outside Ocala. When I drove out to talk to him, he was hosing down the tractor, which gleamed in the afternoon sun. "That's my grandfather's tractor," I said, getting out of my truck. Marcus turned off the hose and looked at me appraisingly. "I paid $4,000 for this at a legal auction. It's mine now." The auction wasn't legal. The HOA had no right to sell my property. It's part of a criminal investigation. "That's between you and the HOA. I bought this in good faith. Look, I understand you paid money for it. I'm prepared to refund what you paid plus an extra $500 for your trouble. But that tractor belonged to my grandfather. It's been in my family for 70 years. I need it back." Marcus crossed his arms. "It's worth way more than $4,500. I've already had people offer me $15,000 for it." "Then sell it to them. But it's not yours to sell. That's stolen property. And if you don't return it voluntarily, the sheriff is going to come take it anyway, and you won't get anything." His jaw tightened. "You threatening me?" "No, I'm explaining reality. The HOA is under criminal investigation for theft and fraud. Everything they sold at that auction is stolen property. The law is clear. You can't acquire legal title to stolen property, no matter how much you paid or whether you knew it was stolen. Which means the tractor is still legally mine. You can either work with me, take the refund plus extra for your trouble, or you can fight it and end up with nothing. Your choice." We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Marcus sighed. "Fine, but I want $6,000 total. I spent time and money getting this thing running better than it was. $5,000, and that's my final offer. Deal." Getting the tractor back felt like a huge victory. It wasn't the same as having everything returned, but it was the most important piece, the one with the most sentimental value. I drove it back to the barn that evening as the sun was setting, parking it in its old spot, and I could almost feel my grandfather's presence, could almost hear him telling me to fight for what was right. The HOA's 7 days to produce documentation came and went with no compliance. Nicole filed a motion for contempt, and we got another hearing. This time, Walsh showed up with boxes of papers, claiming they'd compiled everything we'd requested. Judge Chen was not impressed. "Counsel, I ordered this documentation 7 days ago. You're now 12 days late. Why should I not hold your clients in contempt?" "We needed time to gather all the relevant materials, Your Honor. The HOA has extensive records and, Mr. Walsh, I'm going to stop you right there. You had months to keep proper records of your auction. The fact that it took you nearly 2 weeks to produce documentation suggests either gross incompetence or deliberate obstruction." "Which is it?" Walsh said nothing, and Judge Chen continued. "I'm fining the HOA $1,000 per day for every day they were late. That's $12,000, payable to Mr. Sawyer within 30 days. Additionally, I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Sawyer's legal fees to date. Ms. Ramsey, please submit a detailed accounting within 3 days." "Yes, Your Honor." "And Mr. Walsh, you will personally ensure that your clients comply with all future orders from this court in a timely manner, or I will consider sanctions against you as well. Are we clear?" "Yes, Your Honor." Nicole and I went through the HOA's documentation that afternoon in her office, and it was a disaster for them. The supposed inspection report was clearly fabricated, with findings that were copied nearly word for word from a generic building inspection template we found online. The notices they claimed to have sent me were dated, but had no proof of mailing, no certified mail receipts, nothing. And the auction records showed that they'd sold $43,000 worth of my property for only $11,000, and then administrative fees had eaten up another $4,000 of that, leaving only $7,000 that actually went to the HOA's general fund. They basically stole $43,000 of your property and profited $7,000 from it, Nicole said, shaking her head. The rest just vanished into someone's pocket or got wasted on auction house fees that were probably inflated. This is fraud on top of theft. Can we prove it? We're going to try. I'm going to subpoena the auction house records and the HOA's financial records. If there's evidence of self-dealing or kickbacks, we'll find it. The criminal investigation was moving forward too. Detective Sarah Kim, who'd taken over the case from Deputy Martinez, called me in for another interview. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, but she had the case details down cold. Bruh. We've established that the inspection report was falsified, she told me, sitting across from me in the interview room. Robert Chen confirmed that someone forged his signature, and we have handwriting analysis showing that the signature doesn't match his actual signature on file. We're working on tracing who actually created the document. Has to be Deborah or someone working directly for her. We're looking closely at Ms. Finch and also Patricia Holloway, the office manager. But we need solid evidence. Do you know if there are any security cameras at the HOA office or anywhere else that might have captured who printed the document? No idea, but someone had to prepare it. Can you check their computer systems? We're working on a warrant for that. The HOA's attorney is fighting it, claiming attorney-client privilege, but we think we can get around that. The crime fraud exception should apply here. What about charges? When will those be filed? Detective Kim hesitated. These cases take time to build properly. We want to make sure we have everything buttoned up before we go to the state attorney's office. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Sawyer. Based on what we have so far, I expect to see multiple felony charges filed within the next month or two. Grand theft, fraud, forgery, possibly racketeering if we can show a pattern of this kind of behavior with other homeowners. Racketeering? We found 3 other homeowners in the same subdivision who claim the HOA has inappropriately fined them, seized their property, or forced them into expensive compliance measures. If we can establish that this is part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, the charges get much more serious, and the penalties get much stiffer. That evening, I got an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice said, "Mr. Sawyer, this is Patricia Holloway. We spoke before at the HOA office." "I remember. What do you want?" "I need to talk to you, not on the phone. Can we meet somewhere?" Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, but curiosity won out. "Okay. Where?" "There's a coffee shop on Silver Springs Boulevard called The Daily Grind. Can you meet me there in an hour?" I called Nicole first and told her about the call. She advised me to record the conversation if Florida law allowed it, which it did since Florida is a 2-party consent state, and I could tell Patricia I was recording. Then I drove to the coffee shop, got there early, and picked a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. Patricia showed up looking stressed and tired, wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of her usual business casual. She ordered a coffee and sat down across from me. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me." "You're right, I don't. What do you want?" She took a breath. "I want to tell you what really happened. I'm going to record this conversation on my phone too, if that's okay, because I want documentation of what I'm saying." This was interesting. "Go ahead." We both set our phones on the table, recording. Patricia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and started talking. "I've worked for the HOA for 3 years. For the first year and a half, it was fine. Boring, but fine. Then Deborah Finch got elected president and everything changed. She became obsessed with property values and community standards, which really meant forcing everyone to make their homes look exactly how she thought they should look." "Okay," I said cautiously. "She started going after anyone who didn't fit her vision. She tripled the number of violation notices we sent out. She pushed through huge fine increases. People were getting hit with thousands of dollars in fines for things like having the wrong color mailbox or parking their truck in their driveway instead of the garage. It was insane, but the board went along with it because she's pushy and forceful, and most of them just wanted to avoid conflict." "What about my property?" Patricia's expression turned pained. "She's been obsessed with your property since day one. She hates that your family refused to sell to the developers. She sees it as a blight on the community, even though, honestly, most people think your place looks nice. It's got character that these cookie-cutter houses don't. But Deborah couldn't stand it. So she made up violations. Worse, she knew you weren't actually part of the HOA. I found the county records showing your property was exempt, and I showed them to her. She told me to bury them and never mention it again. She said that as long as you didn't fight back, we could treat you like you were part of the association. I felt anger building but kept my voice level. And you just went along with it? I needed the job. I'm a single mom with 2 kids. Jobs aren't easy to find in Ocala. I know that's not an excuse, but that's the reality. I did what I was told and tried not to think about it too hard. What about the inspection report? Patricia looked down at her coffee. Deborah created it herself. She used Robert Chen's name because he'd done some work for the HOA a few years ago, and she had his license number on file. She never thought anyone would actually check. She just copied some generic inspection language she found online, made up some findings, and forged his signature. Do you have proof of this? I saved the original file she created. It's still in the HOA's computer system, with her user account logged as the creator. I can testify to watching her make it, and I have emails where she discussed planning the whole thing. Why are you telling me this now? Patricia met my eyes. Because the police are going to figure it out anyway, and I don't want to go to jail for something Deborah did. I was complicit, I know that, but I didn't create the fake report or authorize the seizure. That was all her. And I have a lawyer now who says if I cooperate with the investigation and testify truthfully, I'll probably avoid criminal charges. You want immunity in exchange for testimony? Yes, but I'm also telling you because what Deborah did was wrong, and I feel terrible about it. Your property never should have been touched. The whole thing was illegal from start to finish, and I should have spoken up sooner. I'm sorry. I studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine or just self-preservation. Probably a bit of both. What else can you tell me? The auction was rigged too. Deborah's brother-in-law owns the auction house they used. He undervalued everything deliberately so it would sell cheap, and then he and Deborah split the difference between what items sold for and what they were actually worth. Some of your more valuable items never even made it to the auction. They were sold privately, and the money went straight into Deborah's pocket. Can you prove that? The HOA's financial records will show the payments to the auction house don't match the auction receipts, and I have text messages between Deborah and her brother-in-law discussing it. I'll turn everything over to the police. We talked for another 30 minutes, with Patricia giving me details on everything she knew. When we finally left the coffee shop, I went straight to Detective Kim's office and called Nicole to meet me there. Patricia had agreed to come in the next morning to give an official statement. This breaks the case wide open, Detective Kim said after I played her the recording. With Patricia's testimony and the evidence she can provide, we have everything we need to file charges. I'm going to brief the state attorney's office tomorrow. Things moved quickly after that. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, I got a call from Detective Kim. We're executing arrest warrants today, she said. I wanted to give you a heads up. Deborah Finch is being charged with grand theft, fraud, forgery, and racketeering. Her brother-in-law is facing similar charges. A couple of the board members are being charged as accessories. It's going to be all over the news. Thank you for letting me know. I turned on the local news at noon and watched as Deborah was led out of her house in handcuffs, her face pale and shocked. The charges were read out, 23 counts covering not just what she did to me, but similar schemes she'd run against 6 other homeowners over the past 2 years. The total theft was over $200,000. The news coverage was extensive. A reporter even came to my property to interview me. I kept it simple, explaining what had happened and emphasizing that HOAs need oversight because they can become tools for abuse when run by the wrong people. The civil case moved toward settlement after that. With criminal charges filed and Patricia's testimony available, the HOA's insurance company started pushing for a deal. Their attorney, Walsh, reached out to Nicole with a settlement offer. They're offering full fair market value for all your property, plus $50,000 in damages, plus all your legal fees, Nicole told me over the phone. That comes out to about $175,000 total once we add everything up. What about the HOA itself? Do they get shut down? The board has been dissolved, and there's a court-appointed administrator running things while they figure out if the HOA can continue to operate. Most of the homeowners are voting to disband it entirely. They're horrified by what happened and don't want to be associated with it anymore. I want to accept the settlement, but only if it includes a permanent declaration that my property is exempt from any future HOA, even if they form a new one. I'll make that a condition. Give me a day to negotiate the final terms. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. I got a check for $175,000, and my property was formally declared exempt from any HOA restrictions in perpetuity. The declaration was recorded with the county and made part of my deed. I used some of the money to buy back items that I hadn't been able to recover, scouring antique shops and online auctions for tools and equipment similar to what I'd lost. It wasn't the same as having the originals, but it helped fill the empty spaces in the barn. The criminal case took longer. Deborah's trial didn't happen until almost a year later. I testified, along with Patricia and several other homeowners. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury convicted her on all 23 counts. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all the victims. Her brother-in-law got 6 years. 2 of the board members who'd knowingly participated got probation and community service. Patricia, true to the deal her lawyer worked out, testified truthfully and wasn't charged with any crimes, though she lost her job and had trouble finding work afterward. I actually felt a little bad for her. She'd been caught up in something bigger than she could handle, and while she'd made bad choices, she'd ultimately done the right thing. The Riverside Meadows HOA was officially disbanded 6 months after Deborah's arrest. The homeowners voted overwhelmingly to dissolve it and filed the necessary paperwork with the county. There were a few people who wanted to keep some kind of neighborhood organization, but the majority decided the risks outweighed any benefits. Standing in my barn on a Saturday afternoon about 18 months after this whole nightmare started, I looked around at the space I'd slowly been refilling. My grandfather's tractor sat in its spot, restored and running better than ever. New tools hung on the walls, and I'd rebuilt my workshop section. I'd even found some of the old family photos at an estate sale, boxes of pictures that had been mixed with other items from the auction and resold. Not everything, but enough. The barn itself stood solid as ever, exactly as safe and sound as it had been before Deborah declared it condemned. I'd had an actual licensed structural engineer inspect it just to have official documentation, and his report confirmed what I'd always known. The building was in excellent condition and would probably stand for another 60 years. I heard a truck pulling into my driveway and walked outside. It was Bill Henderson, the man who'd been the first to return items from the auction. We'd become friends over the past year, bonding over the shared experience of this mess. "Hey, Harrison," he called out. "Brought you something?" He reached into his truck bed and pulled out an old wooden sign, hand-painted, with Sawyer Farm spelled out in faded letters. "Found this at a flea market. The vendor said he got it at some estate auction a while back. Figured it might be yours." I took the sign, running my fingers over the letters my grandfather had painted probably 50 years ago. It had hung on the barn until sometime in my childhood, when weather finally made it too faded to read. My dad had taken it down but kept it in the barn, meaning to restore it someday. "Bill, this is perfect. Thank you. Thought you could hang it back up now that everything's settled." We spent the afternoon doing exactly that, mounting the sign above the barn doors where it had hung for decades. As we stood back to admire our work, Bill said, "You know, this whole thing with the HOA, it's made a lot of people around here think twice about these organizations. There's talk of putting some regulations in place at the county level, requiring more oversight and accountability." Good. No one should have to go through what I went through, or what the other victims went through. "You going to be at the town hall meeting next week? They want people to testify about HOA abuses." "Yeah, I'll be there. Might as well use this experience to try to prevent it from happening to someone else." The sun was setting as Bill drove away, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I stood in front of the barn, looking at that old sign with my family name on it, and felt something settle in my chest. This property had been in my family for generations, and it would stay in my family for generations more. No HOA, No Deborah Finch, no one was going to take that away. I walked back into the barn, running my hand along my grandfather's tractor as I passed. The space felt alive again, full of tools and equipment and the promise of future projects. I'd lost a lot in this fight, but I'd also gained something valuable. The knowledge that I could stand up to bullies and win, that the law still meant something, and that there were good people willing to help when you're in the right. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. Judge approved the final restitution payments today. You should see the last $50,000 within a week. Congratulations on seeing this through to the end. I typed back a quick thanks and put the phone away. The money was nice, but it had never been about the money. It was about principle, about protecting what was mine, about making sure that petty tyrants like Deborah couldn't just steamroll over people's rights because no one bothered to fight back. The next week, I attended the county commission meeting where they were discussing HOA regulations. The room was packed with homeowners, many of them with their own horror stories about HOA overreach. I testified for 15 minutes, walking through my experience and making specific recommendations for oversight measures. The commission seemed receptive. They appointed a task force to develop regulations requiring HOA boards to carry insurance, submit to regular audits, and follow specific procedures before assessing fines or taking any action against a property. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start. After the meeting, several people came up to thank me for speaking out. One woman, elderly and walking with a cane, gripped my hand tightly. My HOA tried to force me to remove a ramp I built for my wheelchair-bound husband, she said, tears in her eyes. They said it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Hearing your story gave me the courage to fight back. I hired a lawyer, and we won. Thank you. Stories like that made the whole nightmare worthwhile. If my fight prevented even one person from being victimized by an out-of-control HOA, then all the stress and expense and aggravation had been worth it. As months turned into a year and then longer, life slowly returned to normal. I rebuilt my workshop, replaced my tools, got back into woodworking as a hobby. The barn became my sanctuary again, a place where I could lose myself in projects and feel connected to my grandfather and father. I started dating someone too, a woman named Sarah who worked at the local library. She'd followed the news coverage of my HOA battle and thought I was either very brave or very stubborn. Probably both, I admitted. She liked that about me. She also loved the property, the big old barn, the open space, the fact that it felt like a real piece of land instead of another cookie-cutter subdivision house. About 2 years after everything was settled, Sarah and I got married in the barn. We cleaned it up, decorated it with lights and flowers, and filled it with friends and family. Bill Henderson was there, and Nicole Ramsey, and even Deputy Martinez and Detective Kim. People who'd helped me through the darkest time in my life, now celebrating with me in the barn that had been at the center of it all. During the reception, my friend Tom, who'd known me since high school, raised a glass for a toast. To Harrison, he said, who taught us all that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it seems impossible, who stood up to bullies and won, and who proved that one person can make a difference. Everyone drank to that, and I felt Sarah squeeze my hand. Looking around at all the people in the barn, at the space that my grandfather had built and that I'd fought to protect, I felt genuinely happy for the first time since before this whole mess started. The barn stood solid and strong, just as it always had, just as it always would. No condemned signs, no HOA threats, no Deborah Finch trying to tear down what generations of my family had built. Just a good, solid building full of memories and surrounded by people who mattered. That was worth fighting for. That was worth everything. A few weeks after the wedding, I was working in the barn on a Saturday morning when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking nervous. They introduced themselves as new homeowners in what used to be the Riverside Meadows subdivision. "We heard about what happened to you," the woman said, "with the HOA and everything. Some people are trying to start a new association, and they're pressuring everyone to join. We don't want to, but we're not sure of our rights." I invited them in and spent an hour explaining what I'd learned, sharing Nicole's contact information, walking them through how to check if their deed had any restrictions, and explaining their options for protecting their property rights. The most important thing, I told them, is to not ignore it. Don't assume the HOA has authority they don't actually have. Check everything, document everything, and get a lawyer involved early if they start making threats. Most people give in because they're scared or don't know their rights. Don't be most people. They thanked me profusely and left with pages of notes. As I watched them drive away, I realized this was probably going to keep happening. People who'd heard my story and needed help navigating their own HOA issues. Part of me resented becoming the local HOA expert, but another part of me felt obligated to help. If my experience could protect other people from going through what I went through, that was a good thing. Over the following years, I probably consulted with 30 or 40 homeowners dealing with HOA disputes. I connected them with Nicole, shared documentation, testified at a few trials as an expert witness on HOA overreach. I even got invited to speak at a state legislative hearing about HOA reform. The barn became a symbol of sorts in the local community. People would drive by to see the building that had sparked such a major case. Some of them stopped to take pictures or ask questions. I didn't mind. Let it be a reminder that homeowners have rights and that HOAs can't just do whatever they want. 3 years after the initial incident, I got a letter from the state attorney's office. Deborah was up for parole, and as a victim, I had the right to submit a statement and attend the hearing if I wanted. I thought about it for a long time before deciding to write a statement but not attend in person. In my statement, I acknowledged that Deborah had served her time and that I believed in rehabilitation. But I also detailed the impact her actions had on me and the other victims, the stress and financial harm, the violation of trust. I recommended that parole be denied until she'd served at least half her sentence, which would be another year. The parole board apparently agreed. Deborah's parole was denied, and she'd remain in prison for at least another year before she could apply again. Sarah asked me if I felt good about that decision. I told her I didn't feel good or bad about it. I felt like justice was being served, which was all I'd wanted from the beginning. Deborah had committed serious crimes that hurt multiple people. She needed to face consequences for that. Whether those consequences included serving her full sentence or getting out early on parole, that wasn't really my call. I'd just given my honest opinion when asked. Life moved on. Sarah and I talked about starting a family. I got a promotion at work, which meant better pay and more security. The barn got a new roof, which it desperately needed, and I built an addition on the back for extra storage. The property that had been in my family for generations would hopefully be in my family for generations more. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'd sit in the barn with a beer and just think about everything that had happened. The shock of seeing that condemned sign. The rage of finding everything gone. The long, stressful months of legal battles and uncertainty. The satisfaction of watching Deborah led away in handcuffs. The peace of knowing it was finally over. I'd learned a lot about myself through this experience. I'd learned that I was tougher than I thought, that I could stand up to pressure and intimidation, that I could fight back against injustice even when it seemed overwhelming. I'd also learned the value of good people, people like Nicole and Bill and Detective Kim who'd stood beside me when I needed help. Most importantly, I'd learned that the system, for all its flaws, still worked. It was slow and expensive and frustrating, but in the end, the law had protected my rights. The truth had come out. Justice had been served. That gave me faith in institutions that a lot of people had lost. 5 years after the condemned sign first appeared on my barn door, I was featured in a documentary about HOA abuses in America. The filmmakers interviewed me in the barn, capturing the space that had been at the center of the controversy. They filmed me working on projects, talking about my grandfather and the property's history, explaining what had happened and how I'd fought back. The documentary aired on a major streaming platform and got a lot of attention. Suddenly, I was getting emails and calls from people all over the country with their own HOA horror stories. Some of them just wanted to vent, others wanted advice. A few wanted me to help them fight their battles. I did what I could, sharing resources and connecting people with attorneys who specialized in HOA law. I couldn't fight everyone's battles for them, but I could at least point them in the right direction and give them hope that fighting back was possible. The documentary also led to speaking opportunities. I was invited to address property rights organizations, homeowner groups, even a national conference on community association management. I always said yes because I felt like I had a responsibility to use my platform to push for change. My message was always the same. HOAs can serve a useful purpose, but they need oversight, accountability, and limits on their power. No organization should have the authority to seize and sell someone's property without proper legal procedures. No one should lose their home or their possessions because they couldn't pay HOA fines for minor violations. And no one should be forced into an HOA without their knowledge and consent. The speaking engagements led to consulting work. Law firms started hiring me to provide expert testimony in HOA cases, drawing on my experience and the research I had done. It became almost a second job, and the money was good enough that I could afford to be selective about which cases I took. I only worked on cases where the homeowner was clearly being victimized and the HOA was clearly overstepping its authority. Through all of this, the barn remained my anchor. No matter how busy life got, I could always retreat to that space, work with my hands, and feel connected to my roots. The building my grandfather constructed with pride and skill. The space where my father had taught me so much. The barn that I'd fought to protect and that now stood as a testament to the importance of standing up for what's right. Sarah and I had our first child 6 years after the HOA incident, a daughter we named Helen after my grandmother. I brought her out to the barn when she was just days old, holding her carefully as I showed her the tractor her great-great-grandfather had driven, the tools her great-grandfather had used, the space that was now part of her heritage. This almost got taken away, I told her, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. But we fought for it. And now it's yours, and someday you'll pass it on to your kids, and it'll stay in the family where it belongs. Helen grew into a toddler who loved the barn, wandering around, touching everything with sticky fingers, asking endless questions about what each tool did. I started teaching her simple woodworking projects, just like my father had taught me. The cycle continuing, generation after generation, in this space that had almost been stolen away. I never forgot what Deborah Finch had tried to do, how close I'd come to losing everything. How easily it could have gone differently if I hadn't had the resources to fight back, if I hadn't found Nicole, if Patricia hadn't come forward with evidence. So many things had to go right for justice to prevail. That's why I kept fighting, kept speaking out, kept helping other homeowners in similar situations. Because for every story like mine that ended well, there were probably dozens where the homeowner gave up, couldn't afford to fight, lost their property to HOA overreach. Those stories didn't make the news. Those people didn't get justice. And that wasn't right. 10 years after that condemned sign appeared on my barn, I attended a ceremony at the county courthouse. The commission was passing new regulations for HOAs operating in Marion County, regulations that included many of the reforms I'd advocated for. Mandatory insurance, regular audits, strict procedures for fines and enforcement, limits on what HOAs could do without court orders, protections for homeowners facing financial hardship. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Real, meaningful progress that would protect future homeowners from the kind of abuse I'd endured. The commission chair thanked me by name during the ceremony, acknowledging that my case had been the catalyst for these reforms. After the ceremony, an elderly man approached me. He had tears in his eyes. "I'm Robert Chen," he said, "the building inspector whose signature was forged on that fake report. I wanted to thank you. What happened to you, them using my name for their fraud, it could have destroyed my reputation and my business. But you fought back and exposed the truth. You saved me too." We shook hands, two men whose lives had been tangled up in Deborah Finch's schemes, both of us grateful that the truth had finally won out. Walking back to my truck after the ceremony, I thought about how one moment, one decision, one act of standing up for yourself can ripple outward in ways you never expect. If I'd given up, if I'd just accepted the HOA's actions and walked away, Deborah would have kept victimizing people. The reforms wouldn't have happened. Robert Chen's reputation might have been damaged. All the people I'd helped over the years would have faced their battles alone. But I hadn't given up. I'd fought back, and it had made a difference. The barn still stands today, solid and strong, a physical reminder that some things are worth fighting for. My daughter plays in it now, building her own memories in the space where generations of Sawyers have worked and lived and dreamed. The condemned sign is long gone, replaced by that old hand-painted Sawyer farm sign that hangs above the doors. Sometimes people ask me if I regret buying the property, if I wish I'd just sold out to the developers and avoided all this trouble. I always tell them no. This land is my heritage. This barn is my connection to the past and my gift to the future. Fighting for it wasn't trouble. It was purpose. And in the end, that's what mattered. Not the money or the news coverage or the speaking engagements or even the legal victory, though those were all good things. What mattered was that I'd stood up for what was right, protected what was mine, and made sure that my daughter would inherit not just property, but the knowledge that her father had been willing to fight for it. The barn stands. The farm remains. The family continues. And somewhere in a Florida prison, Deborah Finch serves her time. A cautionary tale about what happens when petty power goes unchecked and someone finally fights back. That's my story. That's how the HOA declared my barn condemned and sold everything inside, only to discover that they'd never had the authority to do any of it in the first place. It cost them hundreds of thousands in damages, criminal convictions for their leaders, and ultimately the dissolution of their entire organization. And me? I got my barn back, my property protected, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes David really does beat Goliath. You just have to be willing to pick up the sling and take your shot.